Okay, here we go. So thank you, Adrian, for being here. For those of you that don't know, because I'll share this later with our reading group, Adrian was the first speaker for this science fiction book talk, and we talked about Trillion of Time last time. And one of the questions that we asked you, Adrian, was, "How are you so prolific?" And your response was poor work-life balance.
Yeah, I mean that has not changed, honestly. I mean, I've got to. I mean, I can expand that in a less sort of
Pithy.
a less spurious manner.
Mhm.
Um, I having spoken to a lot of other authors, and obviously, I get the prolific thing a lot. I I enjoy writing. Um, there are a surprising number of authors for whom it is a bit tooth-pulling still, and they enjoy having written, but not the writing itself. I genuinely love the writing process. I can't think of anything else I would rather do with chunks of my day. I think that helps. But also, um, I because I do so much world-based prep, and this is purely, I'm not necessarily saying this is the universal panacea for this sort of thing, but this is purely what works for me. Um, Everything I put into a book in that first draft, ideally, if I've done it properly, fits with everything else. So all of these ideas are coming from the same place. I don't have a long drawn out second or third or whatever draft where I'm having to retcon loads of stuff and change loads of stuff around and so forth. It all goes in so that my first draft and my submission draft are very, very, very similar. Usually barring a certain amount of cutting because I do overwrite.
Yes,
And that helps. So it's not necessarily that I'm writing more um, per day, but I am keeping more of what I write.
yes. And those of you who just arrived, I'm bringing up the first conversation that Adrian had with us on Children of Time. You also mentioned, Adrian, that you love world building, that you could just world build and just do that. And that for you, the struggle is narrative after world building. Was that the same
Yeah,
case with Shroud, and that you built this world, this uh, alien, and then after the world building, you put the narrative in, or was it a in tandem?
Um, sorry, first of all, could I just ask, Jen, would you be able to mute your mic because I'm getting feedback off you. Thank you. Um, so I mean, I love world building. I'm also very reliant on it. But I mean, and again, this is purely a me thing, but when I'm writing a book, I am almost always explicitly writing to show people the world I have thought up. And in order to do that, you do need a plot and characters and things like that. But displaying the world and taking people through the world and showing all the clever things I put into it is very much my starting point. And the characters and the plot generally arise quite organically out of the world I want to show. So it is very much looking at, all right, what are the events that this world is brewing? Because obviously one of the things about creating a world is not a static thing. It is a thing that you're starting off with a snapshot of that world as it progresses from one state to another, because that's how everything works. And usually you'll want to focus in on a particular crisis point or something, something exciting happening, because that is the best way of showing the interesting bits of the world. Um, and so that's where your plot comes from and your character come from. You just look at that point and say, right, who are the interesting people here? Who are the people who display these various different aspects of the setting? So my a lot of writers will start with that plot, they will start with a character they want to write about. Well, I will start with the world, and the characters and the plot hopefully organically arise out of that world. So
Wonderful.
it's all kind of working together, but with me, the world is very definitely the driving force for it all. And that, I mean, the fascinating thing with this sort of thing and listening to other writers talk about their very different processes is at the end of all of these very different processes, you are converging on the same endpoint, which is a book, which has all of these things. And to a certain extent, it doesn't necessarily matter which you are focusing on which order you're doing, because they should all kind of end up there, and you should end up with this seamless whole, which is the book.
I see. Thank you, Adrian. All right, for those of you who are new to this roundtable discussion, I just did a brief introduction, and then we'll move on to the roundtable. Um, this is my last question, then I'll stop monopolizing this. But Adrian, the my question has actually is related to Noemi's review. She posted a couple days ago because she finished it before me, and I watched the review. And my question is, uh, the shrouded aliens are so compelling. They're, and
Thank
I
you.
think we all agree. I mean, no one writes aliens better than you. And we talked a little bit about this in the last discussion with how you constructed the spider civilization. Um, but especially on pages 180 to 185, that transition from the Shrouded's like distant shard that then becomes part of the sea, the coastal version of it. It was just brilliant. And my question to you is, since Children of Time with Avara Kern, you've played with this scattered shard-like self or like scattered minds. Have you always just been obsessed with this idea, and then like just like with Mern and Children of Memory as well, where you explored sort of fragmented consciousness, the how like purpose and self changes when it's scattered. Did you always want to do like this alien in this book, or did it grow from your previous explorations of this concept?
I mean, it's you're right that I do keep going back to it, and I think, but I think the reason I do keep going back to it is not that it's necessarily a thing that's always fascinated me, but just because having touched on it the once, you realize it is a kind of thought experiment you can replay in multiple different ways. So that, because people tend to think, oh, hive mind, and then they have a sort of a fuzzy idea of, well, what would that be like? But having looked at it I mean, I must have had a good half a dozen separate goes at it now. From and so you have Kern, you have bees in Dogs of War, um, arguably Alien Clay, although that's you never see from the perspective of the hive mind in that. Um, I think it's just if you want to do aliens and you want to do alien modes of thought, it's a very obvious thing that we as humans can conceive of, but we don't do. Um, and it is remarkably fertile ground because there are so many takes you can have on it. And I mean, I've got a few others sort of kicking about in the back of my mind, really, as to how one could do it. And it's fascinating because obviously it's a very science fictional thing because we don't particularly, it's not something we can really observe on Earth. I mean, if you look at ants have a kind of a pheromonal communication and they have this sort of what appears to be a sort of an aggregate decision making process between individuals. And that's certainly the closest we come in the animal kingdom. There is also some argument to say that there are interesting things going on in plants and fungi and things like that to do with linking of organisms into a larger kind of network. But it's something that it's that sweet spot. It's something that we don't have, but we can really explore the idea space from where we are. It doesn't go into that just sort of completely inconceivable alien sort of territory.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, it was riveting. That
Yeah.
it never feels authentic. Also,
I
but
suppose yeah, I mean the other thing just purely speaking as sort of disgruntled sort of student of biology, the common concept of hive mind and say social insect and things like that is the idea, well, you have a king or queen type creature, and then all of the other are just kind of drones that are doing what they're told, which is not how ants or bees or anything of that work. Um, it's this enormous misunderstanding that is very much based upon because that's how we organize our societies with kind of people at the top, um, kings and things telling people what to do. That's how we assume it must work, but more so in insects, and it's completely different. They're actually almost a a fundamental. democracy of ideas because all of the individual units are contributing to the decision process. And so I quite like to write hive mind scenarios that challenge that kind of top-down dictatorial picture that science fiction often portrays.
Thank you. Brandon, we'll move on to you for the roundtable, and then we'll just go Brandon, Noemi, Brian, Jen, and John and Chris.
Yeah, Adrian, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. So I did read Shroud. I really enjoyed it,
Thank you.
and you have characters that are both human and alien. So do you find it more difficult to write from the alien perspective or the human perspective?
It varies from book to book. I am generally quite comfortable writing from an alien perspective. In Shroud, it's a particular challenge because the alien, it doesn't have it. I'll say it doesn't have a single perspective, and I don't mean in that it is there are multiples of them. It means that what it is to write the alien varies depending on how many aliens you have in the room, basically. And that was actually quite a challenge because that's not a natural way to write. The fact that you always have to have this intellectual grasp of right, what level of reasoning are they working at? And obviously it goes from very, very basic instinctual all the way up to kind of a super genius sort of broad picture, global picture. And that was the big challenge, or well, one of the big challenges with this book was getting the alien voice. But it was, I mean, I went in with open eyes. It was definitely something I knew I wanted to do. And one of the early scenes I conceived of was that bit where you just end up down with one of them, and it's just got that stream of single syllable words, which is all it's kind of capable of thinking on its own. I knew I wanted to kind of head towards that point as a kind of a revelation moment in the book. Um, in broader terms, usually once I've got a handle on what it's like, what it is like to be the thing I'm writing from, which is just that sort of interface point between the thing and its world, based on its sort of its senses and its priorities and its sort of evolutionary path and all that sort of thing. Once I've got that, I'm generally fairly comfortable in that. And honestly, sometimes human characters are harder.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Noemi?
Sure. First of all, thank you for taking the time to put this together, John, and thank you, Adrian, for being there. I'm a huge fan, and just you being here is a lot to take in, I have to say. Thank you. I've loved Shroud, and I think I have all of your books to this. I think I missed two that I can't find in France. I can't find them to get to me. What I want to ask is, obviously, John said that you have a big thing for hive minds. Hive minds. I'm using the term a bit loosely, but have you had any other ideas for alien minds that you couldn't really put into words or you couldn't really integrate into a story before? Are there some alien drafts somewhere that you can't really pinpoint to now?
I mean, I think there are probably some stories on the back burner which I'm still working out how to bring it over. But I've not had anything where I've actually started on something and not known what to do with it. Usually, again, because of my process, because of the amount of world prep, I'll work out pretty quickly if I can't do a thing that I need to be able to do. So I've had a few. Um, the big bugbear usually is because I'm generally involving human characters. It is a communication thing. It's just like, all right, well, I do need these things to be able to communicate. And I've written several entire books that are based around, right, how are these things going to communicate? But if you don't want to base the book around that, then you've got a bit of a logistical problem. If you just want, the human and the alien to just start having a conversation, because if you're doing hard sci-fi, that's not actually something that's ever going to happen. Or at least you probably have to string together a pretty unlikely series of events before that can really be the case. And so I have had at least one entire book basically collapse because I realized there was no reason why the things I needed to be able to talk to one another could actually do so. And I couldn't work out a way around it.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noemi. Before we move to Brian, speaking of, I got to interrupt real quick, but Adrian, in the first talk, this was in June 28th, 2023. Do you remember if you were working on Shroud? Because when we asked you, all you said was radio. I'm like trying to group.
If I said radio, then I must have had the idea by then.
Okay.
Because certainly this is that. Sorry, can I just give a second? Someone's hoovering. Hi there. Could you? Sorry, I'm on a call at the moment. Can I ask you to go to another room? Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Oh, Noemi, can I ask, what are the books you can't get in France? If I could ask.
Um, well, to put away childish things, cannot find them in English, at least. Like in French, they don't exist, but cannot find them in
Mm.
English. And the other one, I think it's your very first fantasy book. The name is out of my mind right now, but
Empire in Black and Gold?
exactly. This one,
Okay.
impossible to find it anywhere.
Okay. Well, look, if you when I'm done, I'll have a look through my back stocks and see if I've got any spare copies.
Oh, wow. Thank you
And
so
then
much.
if John can get me an address, I'll post them off.
Thank you so much. So kind of you. Thank you
No,
very
you're welcome.
much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, next.
Yes, Brian.
All right. Let's see. Volume's working, yeah?
Just about. You're a bit roboty, but okay.
Okay, sorry, I might be on a bad connection here. Yeah, thank you very much for doing this. I was not able to get a copy of Shroud. I'm actually in Taiwan. They're a little bit slow on the imports, I think. But so my question is, I guess, more geared towards the Children of Time, if that's okay, and maybe some more like general
Sure.
writing process. So I was wondering, in Children of Time, obviously, you span a very large, historical period, right? You're going across so much time, so many years. Do you find it easier to work with like large spans of like time and space as you did in that sort of work, or do you more enjoy to work in a more kind of confined, constrained? I guess yeah. Which one of those do you enjoy more? Which one do you find easier?
I mean, honestly, it was logistically, it was a colossal pain in the neck, having to work at those sort of time periods. The whole inclusion of the nanovirus as a plot device started off purely as a way of shrinking the time period I would need to tell the book in. Because otherwise, if you're looking at evolution, you're looking at like hundreds of millions of years rather than just the thousands of years the book takes place over. I will certainly do. In fact, I'm currently working on the idea of a book where, again, the journey through very long periods of time is an inherent part of the plot, more so, honestly, than in Children of Time. And because I'm going into that with that as the key part of the idea, rather than a problem to be overcome, that's going to be much easier to work with. But it's so this is all right. This is a weird thing that happens in a lot of books. There are an awful lot of books where if you look back on the actual amount of time experienced by the characters over the course of the book, you realize the whole thing took place in like a day and a half. And so they did so much and they went all of these places and just like actually almost no time has passed for them. It is very difficult to write long-term things. I don't mean like necessarily thousands of years. I mean just like having a series of events that takes place over 2 or 3 years, as often, in the real world often happens, is narratively very difficult to do because you kind of feel, well, I need my characters to be doing stuff all the time. And it's very difficult to basically say, oh, yes, dear reader. And then basically they just sat on their hands for 3 months because they didn't know what to do or because they didn't realize there were pressing concerns or anything like that. So managing time in books is generally a very difficult thing. With obviously, because it was such a central thing for Children of Time, it meant I structured the entire book around it. And so it became easier once I had that loop. Good Lord, sorry. I will just give me a second. I don't know who that is. You'll just deliver the phone until they ring off. So once I had that loop of the humans going in and out of suspension and discovering the ship deteriorating whilst the spiders were going from kind of societal state to societal state. That worked out fairly nicely, but it took a lot of logistical messing around. Oh, God. Sorry. I do apologize. Hello, sorry, I can't speak right now. Could you call back later? I mean, originally I was trying to do the human part of Children of Time with them traveling very close to light speed and just doing it with relativity, but which would actually not have worked out as a good enough book. Sorry, as good a book, because the waking and sleeping and finding everything changed each time that Holston wakes up turned out to be a major point of how the human side of the book worked. But the reason I didn't do that was actually logistically, there's no way that society could have had the technology to get up to the near light speeds you would need to make any significant difference in time frame, or certainly the level of significant difference. You've got to get so close to the speed of light to get a really big sort of relativity difference going on.
Thank you, Brian. Jen, move on to you.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for talking with us again. Shroud was fantastic. I really enjoy how you really get into the minds of, I want to say alien, but I don't necessarily mean extraterrestrial, just alien as in completely different than our own. And how do you go about creating these personalities and the just how do you get into the minds of something so different when you're doing the point of view chapters from the other beings?
A very big part of it is the sensorium. So if as soon as you have a creature that is experiencing the world in a different way to human, it's that kind of what is it like to be a bat sort of question. Once you work on that and work out your kind of how you're going to bring that over and how that creature is experiencing the world, it instantly gives you something that's very alien, because different senses is a different description of the world from that creature's point of view. But it's also a different set of priorities, it's a different set of capabilities and abilities. It instantly puts you well outside that standard human viewpoint, even if you're writing for something as similar to us as the dog, for example, because a dog's senses are very different to human senses. Beyond that, you've got, it's a matter of looking at the priorities of what the creature is, and what or what priorities it might have, and how those might drive it. So whether they are artificial priorities, like sort of Rex's relationship with his master in Dogs of War, or whether they are sort of evolutionary or societal priorities, like the spiders and Children of Time or the Shrouded. Again, once you're working in that non-human setup, or at least rather just that non-us setup, as long as you're committing to it, really, as long as you're committing to the bit, you're sitting behind the eyes or whatever sense organs the thing has got of that thing, and just playing that character, really. I mean, possibly this is something I'm getting from my role-playing background, which is honestly a bit of a gift that keeps on giving as far as writing goes. But the idea is, you need to commit to that character. You're playing, you don't go beyond what it would understand. You don't admit to the limits of that a human character would admit to, because frequently I'm working with creatures that are better than human at various things, rather than that traditional alien that is kind of less good at most things than people, which is sort of a standpoint of sort of action sci-fi from the 80s and 70s and 80s, I guess. And I mean, beyond that, it appears to be something that comes relatively naturally to me as a writer, which is obviously why I'm kind of making a living out of it. But I think it's coming from that sort of that character playing standpoint, and that just the logical thought experiment of what it is like to be a ... And I know the whole point of the bat, the philosophical idea with what it's like to be a bat, is that we can't know. But my pushback on that is we can actually, that's what imagination is for. I mean, obviously, yes, we can never know, but we can still make a logically sound working hypothesis as to what it is like to be a bat or a spider or whatever, anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. John?
Thanks again for taking the time to talk with us today. I'm in the same situation as Brian, unfortunately, where I wasn't able to get Shroud, also in Taiwan, like Brian. But I've been reading the Bioform books. I had more or less the same question that Jen just asked you, but I was wondering maybe if you could talk a little more about how you developed the character of Bees, because I found that character really fascinating. How it's a distributed intelligence, but it still has a very distinct personality, like sending almost like memes of the dead birds. That's this really interesting way of communicating.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of so obviously I knew I wanted bees in the squad for Dogs of War at the start. Where I mean that book develops quite organically, and there were definite chunks of that book that I didn't plan, and then obviously I wasn't thinking of it as having a sequel, and so all the stuff in Bearhead was completely unforeseen at the time. So the way Bees develops over those two books, and of course in the third one, which is coming out next month, which is Bee Speaker, which is which is a lot of bees, goes into this in much more detail than I can really now, and certainly you get there. You see a lot of how bees sort of constructs themselves in different instances. I Bees, I think, certainly in Dogs of War itself, Bees is one of those characters that sort of developed while I wasn't looking, in a sense. So I didn't necessarily think that Bees would be as major a role in the series. Well, I didn't realize there was going to be a series when I was writing the first book, but Bees kind of just turned out to be a character with this enormous potential that I hadn't particularly foreseen. I just ran with whatever my imagination suggested Bees would become. So, appropriately enough for a character that is really a constant sort of renegotiation of what they are and what they're doing at any given time. They are a character that I'm really not particularly in control of as to what they're going to be. But yes, I mean, for the major answer to that question is honestly Bee Speaker, and the various events that take place in that, because that has a lot of bees material.
Fair enough. Well, I'm really looking forward to Bee Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We can move on to Chris. Chris, are you there? Do you have a question you'd like to ask? Chris might not be here. Oh, no questions. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I should have said earlier that if you don't have questions, you can that's fine. Adrian, another element of Shroud, which I really enjoyed, was the bleak corporate environment of the ship, and especially, I don't want to give away the end for people that don't know, but the ending was very much right. The corporate structure really, um, uh, it's bleak. And my question is for those of you that don't know, Adrian started writing when he was 17 and 18, and then spent, I think, 10 years submitting a book a year before being published. And during that time,
honestly, 15, but
15, yeah, long time. And during that time, you were working in the legal profession, correct?
Mm.
And my question is, did you experience a lot of sort of corporate uh, bullshit and hierarchy in your work career that then you've been able to, because it feels very, very real, from someone who's worked in a corporate setting, you really understand the roles really well. So do you pull from your past for that,
I
or
mean, honestly, not particularly. I've only ever worked in relatively small firms, and also at a fairly low level. I've always been I've always been quite junior in law when I was in it. So I didn't really get involved in that sort of that high flying, high pressure corporate law stuff. But I mean, honestly, right now, and certainly in the last 20 years, you don't need to be in the profession for that. It is a mindset and an attitude that is being aggressively exported from certain quarters globally. The idea that you're only as good as what you're worth, and there's no such thing as a free lunch, and your only really real role is to basically work until you die. I mean, the sort of media outlets that wish to popularize the idea of quiet quitting for people who are doing what they are contracted to do um, is absolutely sociopathic. And it's not a matter of that being a particular section of like high flying, high value work life. It's a matter of that just being the air that we breathe and the water we swim in at the moment.
Thank you, Adrian. On to Brandon.
So in Shroud, you created this alien ecosystem, and then you kind of have in the interludes kind of an evolutionary history. So how much world building did you do that we don't see in the novel? Is there like a whole? Is there so much more than we just get a narrow view? And also, how much do you put any real like scientific research in? Like how much science goes into this? All
Oh, good. Well, so the basic idea of Shroud was very little more than a few paragraphs on my notes until I ran into, and I forgot. I cannot immediately think of his name, but he's the first person who's in the acknowledgements in the book. He was doing a talk at a convention I was at about basically non-standard biology on potential and exoplanets, and it was amazing. And it just really opened my eyes. And I thought that's the missing ingredient for the idea. It needs to be on this very weird planet where I can start playing with this very because pretty much everything I worked with up to that point has been Earth adjacent. Whether it is an alien world that just happens to have a compatible kind of biochemistry, as in, it's got like Nod, it's got an oxygen atmosphere, it's got a comparable gravity, all of that sort of thing, or whether it's an actively terraformed world, it's all been the sort of place you can literally take off your space helmet and walk around on. Possibly, and then die of horrible plagues, but still. So I thought, right, it's about time I did a proper very non-Earth-like alien world. So I was able to get together with this chap, and we had quite a long talk at the next year's convention. And we just hammered out. I said, right, I need the world to be able to do, I need life to be able to do this, this, and this. What can we do with it? And we just worked out this very, very complex, very intricate way. Like, so you've got it on a moon, and the moon is tidally locked, and it's working this way with the gas giant. And then I wrote up several pages of just this, and basically what was the biochemistry and what molecules are involved and what are the energy pathways and all of that sort of thing. And I sent it to him, and he said, well, this doesn't work and that doesn't work and so forth. So this is probably the most scientifically complicated thing I've ever written. But when I'm doing hard science fiction, I want to be able to do hard science fiction. I want to be able to do something that is not breaking sort of physical laws. In general, I mean, there's this idea of the one big lie, which I do kind of espouse, in that you can frequently have one thing that you are using as just a narrative convenience that is kind of complete nonsense. And then everything else should work solidly. So in Children of Time, the nanovirus is the one big lie. It is entirely a convenient plot device, but then became an absolute cornerstone of the plot, because I realized how it could kind of give me the understandings, which is something I needed. But the absolutely crucial thing about Children of Time is that the spiders are not the big lie. The spiders are everything that the spiders do is, or should be, scientifically plausible, because that's actually where the book gets its impact from. It's the idea these are not kind of like magic fairy tale spiders. These are actually a thing that has plausibly evolved, even if that evolution has been accelerated, which is really the only thing that the nanovirus is doing. So with Shroud, everything there has a scientific background. And there are almost certainly bits and bits all over the book which don't really work the way I think they do, and which is entirely me hitting the limits of my own scientific understanding. But I worked really very, very hard to make it all as solid as possible, because I think that's where a lot of that sort of science fiction gets its impact from, is the idea, well, actually, this is a thing that could potentially happen. It's not magic, it's not sort of psychic powers. This is actually entirely based on how we understand the universe to work.
So did you build like way more of the world that we don't see in the book, or is it just
There's a fair amount. I mean, the evolution chapters mean I can showcase a lot of stuff that you're not getting actively to see, and that is pretty much the entire reason those chapters are in there, is so I can show off. And there are ecosystems I thought up that I couldn't work out why they would need to go through. There's all sorts of interesting stuff. I mean, one of the big problems with Shroud, of course, is from the human point of view. You do not get to see much of Shroud because it is very dark, and therefore, in all of those scenes where all you're seeing are whatever the lamplight touches, I do know what is out there. I know the wider kind of picture of what is around them. But I mean, weirdly, I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb as a writer. If there is a thing you know a lot about, whether it is the thing that you made up or whether it is the thing that you have researched, the skill is in paring it down to the minimum possible amount of information your reader actually needs, because otherwise things will start to drag. And I mean, this is one thing I do. There's also always stuff that I write that gets taken out by my editors because I do overwrite and I get far too carried away with world building detail that the book doesn't really need. And obviously at that point it becomes a catalogue and it becomes quite dry and slow. And so there are definite chunks that end up on the cutting room floor.
Well, I didn't think Shroud dragged it all, so you did a good job
Well,
there.
and as did my editors in that case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Back to Noemi.
Um, I hope you know that you are a big inspirations for aspiring writers right now. I hope you know that. But what are your inspirations, if you have any? Maybe just like you have a fantastic brain and everything sprouts out super easily, but do you have any inspirations that you go back to sometimes to, regenerate or find new ideas? Maybe if you do that.
I mean, there are always writers who do things that to date I've not been able to do in their prose, and those, I have a little list of, I would like to write a book like this at some point. Frequently it's the case I want to write a book that will give a particular emotional response that I have felt as a reader and that I know I haven't really been able to produce yet as a writer. And those are the goals. So I would like to write a book, for example, that has the deep sense of the numinous that Mythigo would, or Piranesi has, for example. Those are amazing books. They do something, and it's one of those I cannot quite see how they do it. And so I go back to them and I reread them and I try and work out, well, what is it that is conjuring this effect? I would like to write a book that has the kind of very complex, deep layering that Gene Wolfe often gives to his books, for example. And again, it's not something I've got particularly close to, but each time I try and use an element of that, I'm kind of, I'm adding to my toolbox. I'm broadening the sort of thing that I can do. And so, yes, there are always, and there are other writers. There are writers whose style I really like Peter Beagle, for example, or Anna. I mean, a recent current writer. If you don't know her, she is amazing. Is Anna Smith Spark. And yes, these are writers who write in ways that I absolutely don't, and that's why I value their writing, because it's so beautiful. And hopefully, the more of that sort of thing I read, the better my own style is going to become through a sort of osmosis.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Noemi. I believe was it Brian, or I think Brian was after.
Let's see. So this one's not a specific book related question. Um, but speaking of how, kind of building on that, of you being kind of an inspiration for a lot of authors and doing a lot of like pretty cool stuff the last few years. How does it feel to be a double feature on the Hugos this year?
Oh, that's all a bit mad. I mean, I think I am absolutely riding a kind of a hometown advantage wave of voting for the shortlist because, of course, everyone who was at Glasgow got to vote, and so there's a lot of UK voting in there. But yes, I mean that is lovely. That is it is absolutely amazing. I've never been on the novel list before, so to hit there with two books is just frankly insane. To be honest, I don't think I'll get it. I'll say flat out. But I you know getting on a Hugo shortlist, assuming it's a Hugo shortlist that's actually been properly put together, is always an enormous privilege. Getting on any award shortlist is, to be honest. But yes, knowing that I am on the radar to that degree with the Worldcon crowd really, and which is also means with the US crowd, because it's been relatively recently that I've had any kind of footprint in the US as a writer. So the fact that I've got that far that quickly is incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Back to Jen.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about Juna as a character. I thought it was interesting that she was a great point of view character, and that she wasn't like the typical hero. She wasn't the captain, the scientist, the engineer. She was the admin, essentially. What made you choose her? Did that just sort of come about as the story was coming, or
it came about very quickly at the beginning of the book when I was considering, literally, who do I want as my point of view? Because I think I identified quite quickly that it wanted to be a first person story. And I think I just wanted to specifically steer things away from your traditional hyper competent sort of science fiction protagonist. I mean, certainly, if you go back to like the golden age of sci-fi, every protagonist is kind of this hyper competent sort of usually engineer, scientist but usually engineer is most common. So May Saint Etienne is that character. And when you have her and Juna at the beginning in the pod, it's very obvious, right? Well, which of these two characters is going to be doing any of the useful stuff? And it's obviously going to be May, and Juna is kind of dead weight. Except that one of the things that science fiction doesn't tend to look at per se, and one of the things that I think we massively undervalue culturally, is that that social work that is Juna's speciality. She is the grease between the part of the machine that keep everything running. She is the person, she is the flex, basically, in their social system. And you can see, that's obviously not a role that the concerns are explicitly requiring when they're setting up their teams, but you can absolutely see that the reason Special Projects works at all as a team is because Juna is there to absorb all of the shocks that everyone else, all of these other rigid characters, are creating. And what it turns out is, when you've got that dynamic with the two of them in the pod, is actually, yes, they get places because May is an incredibly good engineer, but the only reason May can function is she has Juna, who is able to basically keep her sane and keep her going. And it's a side of things that certainly I don't think I've particularly looked at before, and that science fiction doesn't particularly look at. So I thought that's going to be just a different perspective and a different skill set for a character to have. And honestly, I'm always after trying to do something I've not done before.
Thank you, Jen. Moving back to John.
I love process, as a few people have already mentioned how vivid your characters are. I was wondering, when you have inspiration for a story that you then decide to develop into a full novel, do you tend to kind of start by developing the characters first, or by the plot first, or does it depend on what the story is?
Although, this touches on what we were talking about at the beginning. So what I start with is a world. The world is always the focus of the story I write. And I will work out the details of the world, sort of the, depending on where it is on the kind of the continuum, it's magic or it's technology, it's factions, it's politics, it's sort of axioms really. And from that, the characters and the plot will arise. Um, as I said before, this is a me thing. Most writers do not work in this way. In fact, every writer has a different way of going about things. There is absolutely no right and wrong way of doing things. But for me, the world always comes first, and the world is always the thing I am writing about. But in order to present it as a novel, you kind of have to write about the world through the lens of characters and plot. Otherwise, I would just be writing kind of imaginary sort of travelogues and encyclopedias and atlases and things.
Thank you, John. Chris, we'll move past you unless you have a question. Adrian, this is a very narrow question, but there's a quote I love on page 330, which was, "Inside you is a multitude, all the different selves you might ever have been, many of which you kept locked in the oubliette of your mind because they weren't fit for public consumption." My question to you is, do you think that an individual like humans have is actually an extremely rare case of evolution? Meaning, if you could speculate on all the different forms of life in the universe, this individual um, construct that we use, from your speculative opinion, do you think it's rare in that there would be more life in the universe like the Shrouded that's collective, hive mind-esque rather than individual?
I mean, complex answer that. Obviously, first off, it's incredibly hard to speculate on the real universe because our data set for how evolution works is literally one. So until we encounter a second point in that data set, we really can't know. My gut feeling is that individualistic organisms are probably going to be more common and may well be a stage you move through because in general, once you have evolution giving you life tends towards greater complexity, and a composite creature like the Shrouded is essentially more complicated than individual entities. You know what? I had another point, and I can't think what it was. I'll let you know if it returns to me.
Because it just seemed to the Shrouded were just so, it just felt like it made more sense that they would exist than humans would. That's when I was reading it.
Well, I mean that speaks highly of my ability to bring them over, I guess. I mean the Shrouded are a special case because of the evolution of radio waves that kind of give them a continuous functioning brain across individuals. I mean, interestingly, one of the things I'm kind of bouncing off here is: do people know Werner Vinge's Deepness in the Sky? No, sorry, A Fire Upon the Deep, the first one. In there, you have it works out quite differently, but you also have a kind of a composite-minded creature. In that case, it works in small clusters, and if you get too many, it kind of the noise outweighs the signal, and they go kind of mad. But he's got them doing it as sound. And I love that book, and it is an incredibly good book for bringing the logical solutions of, right, or your aliens are like this. What is their society? What do they think and believe, and all of that sort of thing. And it's an incredibly good book, but the basic mechanic of it scientifically doesn't really hold water because sound is basic. You cannot work with sound quickly enough to maintain the consciousness. So I just reading that eventually I thought, well, but if you were doing it with electromagnetic waves, then they are going as quickly as the neural impulses go in our brains, which sound does not. And then that was what sort of set me on that path. But yeah, I mean, I think when I'm dealing with this sort of distributed intelligence in whatever way, it's either because it's been artificially created or it's because there are some particular conditions in the environment that favor it, really. It's one of the, I genuinely think that it's probably not something you'd encounter necessarily in the real universe without those conditions or without a very, very long and complex evolutionary history, without, say, the interruption of mass extinctions and things like that, where you just got to build complexity on complexity. This is which is absolutely an idea that I'm getting from, there's a web cartoonist called Dresden Kodak, which is amazing stuff. But one of the things, he has just like a brief sideline comic at one point where it's an alt history where the Permian extinction didn't happen. And so the life you've got around at our equivalent time is vastly more complicated in the way it interrelates to each other, because you didn't get that setback where you lost 90% of sort of biodiversity, which I thought that's such a fascinating idea.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. Brandon, back to you.
Just say, by the way, I'm going to have to finish up at in about just over 10 minutes. Is that all right? Okay, so
Yep.
I will say, if you wanted to write an encyclopedia about an imaginary world, I'd read it. But aside from that, so I don't want to spoil the ending of Shroud, but let's just say there were more opportunities for conflict between the Shrouders and humanity. So will we ever see a sequel to Shroud?
As Andrew, I was just asked this on Blue Sky earlier today. So I am not planning a sequel. I don't ever close the door on sequels. It very much depends on if I get a good enough idea. One of the problems, though, Shroud's ending is relatively open as to what happens next. I could probably quite easily write 3 novellas with 3 completely different what happens next going on. I don't think any of them would be that interesting. I think given the novelty of the scenario is explored in that first book, I'm not sure what a second book would do or how it would justify its existence. So essentially it needs another idea to come in and play well with the concept of the Shrouded and how they work. And at that point, that might be where a sequel takes place. But that other idea hasn't turned up yet.
Thank you.
Noemi?
Yeah, in the last few books that you wrote, I couldn't help but notice as an economic worker that a lot of the world that you write are about like capitalistic, hyper economics hellscapes, basically, that are not very nice, almost dictatorships and ideas. Do you think it is genuinely the optimal political and economic environment to go to space? Like, do you think it is optimal in stories, that it is based on reality, essentially, that it is the good way, like the good way, quote unquote, to go and go?
I mean, I kind of hope the way the concerns turn out shows I do not think that it is the optimal way to go to space. I think it's a terrible way of going to space. I think that letting some tech bro billionaire build a company town on Mars where you're dependent on your employer for your oxygen is a dreadful situation. I think it's going to happen, but I don't think it's a good way of happening. And I think there are certainly much, much better ways of doing it. It's just, at the moment, I am writing to a certain extent cautionary tales about what we've got going on Earth at the moment. And, I call it as I see it to a certain extent.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Back to Brian.
So yeah, I actually don't have any more questions at the moment.
And we'll go to Jen.
I don't either. I'll pass it along.
Adrian,
I don't know if John had another one.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I was going to say this. I'm going to say the same.
Yeah.
I'm kind of drawing a blank at the moment.
Okay.
Our identities are merging right now. So it's back to me. Okay. Adrian, the I told you this in the first talk, but your novella Elder Race was the door for me to your work, and I've been steadily moving through your books. My question is, do you ever plan to link some of the universes and worlds, like that, kind of in the back of your mind, where like what happened on the planet in Elder Race has a connection to Shroud or one other book, or
No,
not?
I mean, so we were talking earlier about like the world building stuff that you don't get to see in the book, and what is you. Oh, and there's a question from Chris after this, just in the chat. Um, there is almost always stuff in the nuts and bolts of how the setup came to be, which precludes any two books sharing a timeline or a universe. There are, I mean, arguably, Elder Race and the Expert Systems Brother, or the Expert Systems books, could actually happen in the same universe, but there is zero benefit to either of them in that being the case. It's one of those. If I was to do that and put in an Easter egg like that, it would purely be grandstanding, and much as happens in films when people do that, all it does is really detract from both. Um, Having said that, I absolutely did that in my current fantasy series. There is a fairly deeply buried Easter egg in that, where you can hypothesize that there is a connection between Days of Shattered Faith and the Shadows of the Apt books. But it is purely there to amuse me, and you don't need it for anything. But I've got to say, I know the whole multiverse thing is terribly fashionable. I really feel, I mean, there's that line from Fellowship of the Ring, the film, is like butter spread over too much bread. And I think that's what happens. You just dilute when you start making all of these things share a larger universe. You lose the interesting bits of all of them in an effort to make them all fit together, and you don't gain anything. So it's I don't, I mean, honestly, if I get to the point of deciding, yes, all of my books are obviously in the same universe and this is why, then I should probably have my word processor taken away from me at that point.
Excellent. And yeah,
What was the question from
Chris had a
Chris?
question about whether Blind Sight by Peter Watts inspired.
Oh, I mean, so I Blind Sight was one of the two books, along with A Deepness in the Sky by Vinge, that people were talking about when they read Children of Time. And I hadn't read either of them then, but I went off and read them very, very quickly thereafter. I suspect probably yes, purely because that's such a phenomenally transformational book. So it's one of those, once you've read it, I think it's very hard, would be very hard to say when you're working in the area of weird alien stuff that you're not being influenced by Blindside, because it's such an amazing book.
Thank you. All right, I have one more question, if anyone, but I'll let anyone else ask their final question before Adrian goes. Anyone have a final question?
Sure, I'll ask one. I'll make it quick here. So, do you prefer writing fantasy or sci-fi?
I I mean, what I really like is the fact that I can currently commercially do both. There's a very particular joy to writing a well-constructed science fiction book that fits with how we know things work and is still doing interesting different stuff, but at the same time writing a full-on secondary world fantasy, you have such an unlimited reign for creating, and you're only bound by your own decisions, and that is also an enormous joy. So they both you know they both give different kinds of rewards, I think.
Noemi, Jen, John, Brian, Chris?
I have one very quick question. If you had one advice, like one sentence to authors that are maybe among us, I know I am one, what would it be?
Oh Lord, I mean, there is no. It would be that there is no one advice. It would be that if you're able to take constructive criticism, um, then that's got to be a bonus. It was not a thing I was able to do when I was coming up through the ranks trying to get published. I was very, very defensive of everything I wrote. If I had been able to step back from things a bit more and and get other people's perspectives on stuff, I might well have shaved some of those 15 years off.
Very good advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Noemi. Then Adrian, last final question. Spoiler alert. So if you haven't read it, turn your sound off. At the end of Shroud, as the power of the shrouded increases, you do this very subtle thing that I'm asking if it was conscious or not, which is in the human chapters, there was like a subtle melting of human cells. Like on page 337, it turned out I too was slow to process signals and reply. On page four, like 30 pages later, like they're screaming, like merged together. Was that conscious of you to have sort of the humans' identities start to kind of mix in a way, or was
I would love to say yes, but no, I think that that's probably my subconscious working at that point, but especially towards the end of books, I'm very reliant on my subconscious steering me as to precisely how it should go. And you get to that point and you make these little connections, thematic connections between things you wrote, but they're certainly very spur of the moment decisions with that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, because I thought it was just well done.
I mean, the next person who asks me that, I'm going to say yes, but yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adrian. This has been a pleasure. It feels like it's come full circle because you were our first speaker, and now we have a recorded, wonderful interview of you and talking about Shroud. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Great questions. Enjoyed it.
No, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you.
Oh, I'll look at those books.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John. See you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll share with you I'll do an AI transcript of this and share it with you all. And yeah, Noemi, I can for Adrian to send you books, I can maybe
Sure.
in your email address. All right.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.